Okay, welcome back, people. Hope you had a good weekend and hope you got to view the video, which I saw this morning. Hadn't been viewed by everyone, but once I put that email out, that announcement, I noticed that the number did jump up. So good to know that people are getting the announcements. Uh, that is a video in which I present my views on how to interpret hemispherectomies and the WADA test. There's a lot of controversy over just how to understand what's going on. So I'm going to review that video right now. Then we'll watch another video where the philosopher Richard Swinburne gives his interpretation of split brains. So remember, we saw Michael Gazzaniga in the 1980s, approximately 1985, argue that it's the left hemisphere that's actually conscious. It's like the final station where all this non-conscious processing gets collated and processed finally by the conscious you. So as Michael Gazzaniga circa 1985 or so holds it, as he sees it, your conscious self is in the left hemisphere. Now, not everyone thinks that. In fact, Gazzaniga no longer thinks that. Uh, but V.S. Ramachandran thinks that when you have a split brain patient, you have two two selves, two centers of consciousness, is one way he puts it. Remember, one hemisphere is a theist, believes in God, and the other hemisphere is an atheist, according to this brief test that he did with at least one split brain patient. By the way, this is an anecdote he tells at a talk. I'm not aware of, I haven't found publication on it. Uh, and maybe it's out there. It's not that I've been digging around trying to find it, but I did look some time ago. Okay, so that's Ramachandran's view. Uh, we're gonna we're gonna see what Richard Swinburne has to say about it after a quick review, and there are some other views as well that we'll get to. Any questions before we get started? And good morning, Bobby, in the chat. Okay. Okay, so we looked at split brains, but now we're looking at hemisphere disconnection, which is a term, an umbrella term I use to include hemispherectomies and the WADA test. Because in both cases, there's a portion, a large, significant portion of the brain, the hemisphere, that is either physically disconnected or it's shut down temporarily by anesthesia. Uh, so in the case of the anatomical hemispherectomy, they remove the hemisphere. Now, by the way, in some cases, they just sever all the neurons, all the neural connections, but they leave the hemisphere intact and it's still getting a blood supply and everything. So it's still living organic tissue. It's just not receiving any sensory signals and it's not able to send any motor signals. Uh, okay. Uh, in so that's a hemispherectomy. In the WADA test, the hemispheres are alternately anesthetized. And in some cases, patients can report what it was like. Now, this is a very strange and confusing experience for many patients. And it's made even stranger by the fact that they don't have their whole brain operating so as to understand what's going on. So some patients don't have much to say about what happens. They don't remember it very clearly, et cetera. But some do, as you saw in the video. Uh, so I'm not going to go through everything I did in the video, of course, but I asked you in that video to look at these patient testimonials and focus on when they're referring to themselves in the moment. Like, I could see this and I don't remember feeling scared. Now, strictly the person saying I right now don't remember feeling scared, but you can understand that as if my memory is correct, then I wasn't scared. And who's the I that wasn't scared? Uh, Not the whole brain, right? Uh, Another one says it was. I looked at the object and had the feeling you get when you can't think of a word, like it's on the tip of your tongue. So something like the situation that Sarah Scott is in. Only that was true for all words. It was amazing. I had no words. Who or what had no words? I'm going to argue that it was the right hemisphere, maybe with some subcortical structures, that was suddenly experiencing what it's like to no longer have words. And I will argue further, and this is the admittedly counterintuitive, strange view, that that system, that region of the brain, has been conscious all along. It's just now noticing that things have changed. It used to seem to have words to take part in producing sentences in English, and now it can't do that. And I also tell Jill Bolte Taylor's story and describe some key aspects of it, where she, a neuroanatomist, wakes up realizing that a huge part of her brain is as she puts it, drowning in blood. I think um, swimming, and she says swimming in a pool of blood, right? And she loses a bunch of functions. Now, everyone understands that when you have a stroke, you lose cognitive capacities and motor capacities and sensory capacities. Often, if it's a serious one, you do. Uh, but most of us tend to think of that as a single conscious self undergoing those experiences. And I think that's where I think that very intuitive view just can't stand up to the medical facts. So moving forward uh, in our review, I have these two arguments. And in my published work, the original case, the original argument is four propositions, three premises and a conclusion. And I've condensed it into now just two premises and a conclusion. But it's the same argument, it's just presented differently. So, and I will repeat this part. In some cases, at least, there's a conscious experience that begins before a hemisphere is removed and ends after it, and we'll call that a detachment experience. And I think that's just medically and scientifically uncontroversial, right? Uh, that's just a fact. Um, I I think philosophically you can raise questions about whether a a, a being is acting merely as if it has conscious experience when in fact it doesn't, and that's worth pursuing and thinking about. But I think medically we have no reason to to believe that. Two, this detachment experience must be realized by the surviving portion of the brain, not by the whole brain, because the whole brain now includes it is now not even intact, right? The other hemisphere is soon enough dead. It's just inert dead matter, uh, and and so this portion of the brain, the one we'll call it the survivor, right, had conscious experience before the hemispherectomy. So I'm just going to pause with that argument for a moment to see if there are questions or thoughts. And this argument generalizes to strokes. So it's not just about uh, the the portion of the brain that survives the hemispherectomy. It would apply to the portion of the brain that survives a stroke, like in the case of Jill Bolte Taylor. She's written a book about this. She's done TED Talks, etc. And what part of her brain did all that after the stroke? The surviving portion. The surviving portion remembers what it was like before the stroke and noticed a difference. So again, I'm arguing that that portion before the stroke was already consciously aware. Not that it was thinking of itself like, oh, it's so interesting to be a part of a brain interacting with the rest of the brain. Of course, it's not thinking that. We just normally don't think that way about ourselves, anyways. Uh, okay, so that's the argument from hemispherectomy. In the chat, Alejandro says, throughout the videos, I was wondering about the sentiment of consciousness for when the body senses disconnection, even under anesthesia. Um, you're reminding me, Alejandro, of a question someone asked a class or two ago. And the person who asked, I don't know if you're here, you asked about synchronization. How do the hemispheres synchronize? And I thought you meant neural synchronization. And so I gave an answer that, I kind of gave an I don't know answer. But then I realized later you probably just meant how is it that we seem to have a whole mind? And if that's what you meant, then yes, a lot of us work on that, including me. But the way the question was phrased led me to think about neurons synchronizing. And there's this question about how neurons sync up uh, that I don't know a lot about. So if you're out there and you want to repeat uh, your question, please go ahead. And it might be answered indirectly as we go through this material. And maybe I'll go back to the video and find out who that was who asked the question. So back to Alejandro. Um, I was wondering about the sentiment of consciousness for when the body senses disconnection, even under anesthesia. Well, so in the case of in the WADA test, well, okay, in a hemispherectomy, the patient might be fully anesthetized, and then it's not clear that they experience anything. There are theories about kind of a low grade awareness under anesthesia, and there are, to the horror of many, there are cases of people being aware while under anesthesia. It seems to happen 1 out of 1,000 times, they say, and so you can be aware during surgery. Um, Fortunately, in some, but not all cases, in some cases, you can be aware during surgery, but not terrified or in pain. So some people can recall conversations being had by the doctor and the nurses, and so they can prove that they were aware. And fortunately, in some cases, they weren't feeling pain and terrified because their body was paralyzed. But in other cases, people are traumatized to go through such events. So that's a side note, and that maybe that addresses what you're thinking about, Alejandro. But if you're asking about the WADA test, well, then anesthesia only occurs one hemisphere at a time. So during the WADA test, what they do is they thread a catheter, usually from the artery in your inner thigh, and they thread that all the way up into the brain or just below the brain, and they're able to steer it one way or the other. And it's just something about brain anatomy that allows you to, for a short period of time, 5 to 10 minutes, you can anesthetize only one hemisphere. And they can verify this in different ways. I think I mentioned that, if your right hemisphere goes to sleep and your arms are up, your left arm will fall. They also kind of tag the anesthetic with a like radioactive glucose, usually radioactive in a way that's harmless, but that allows them to see on a screen that only the right hemisphere is asleep. And so it's like a glowing half of your brain. And in some cases, it starts to seep over, and they start to realize, okay, we're no longer just anesthetizing the right hemisphere, and then they wait, and then they rethread that catheter, and then they anesthetize the left hemisphere, and your right arm goes down. It's touch and go. It's not. I'm kind of giving an ideal version. Sometimes the patients don't respond at all. Sometimes they have emotional outbursts, start crying. Um, they the doctors have to yell pretty loudly because the patient might be drifting off, losing consciousness. uh, and and so it's an unpredictable, imperfect method. But you do get these uh, these testimonials. The argument from hemispherectomy is no different, except we're talking about a temporary detachment, and so I'm arguing that the portion that stays awake when say the left hemisphere goes to sleep was conscious prior to that, because it's now having a memory of what it used to be like when it had words, and it's now comparing that to now when it doesn't have words. And there's the only difference. Okay, any questions or thoughts? Okay. So both arguments conclude that a hemisphere is independently conscious prior to the disconnection. Um, uh, there are a number of people in neuroscience, in cognitive science, and philosophy who accept that consciousness resides in the surviving portion after the disconnection. But they tend to balk, many people tend to balk at the idea that it's independently conscious prior to the disconnection. But as I said, I've presented this many times. I've probably presented this more often to neuroscientists than to philosophers, and usually it's a mixture of both. Uh, and I was surprised first that I don't think it's ever been met with a strong objection, uh, and we'll get to objections. Um, Also, I was surprised that I've had neuroscientists come up and say, "Yeah, I totally think that that's exactly, and just different regions of the brain are independently conscious." And I thought I would get more pushback. Okay, because it's not like everyone's talking about it, and it seems pretty, important. McCade, go ahead, please.
Can you clarify what you mean by independently conscious? Because I'm trying to, my understanding of it is with the single mind thesis, this is an argument against it.
Yeah,
But you say it has multiple conscious entities, and that kind of leads me to think that it's like multiple personalities or perhaps like different people. Um, so can you just clarify that?
I'll try. Yeah, I purposely try to avoid discussing people or uh, persons, uh, but it raises questions about that. What I mean by independent is what I'm not saying is simply that the right hemisphere plays a role in the consciousness of the whole self. I think everyone can agree that that's probably true. What I'm saying is that whether or not, so pick the right hemisphere for now, whether or not the left hemisphere is active, this thing is conscious. So its consciousness is independent of what's going on elsewhere. Now, that's just the state of being conscious. Now, what it experiences does depend on what's going on elsewhere. So, if the left hemisphere is active, then it feels like it has words. And if the left hemisphere is inactive, then it suddenly realizes it doesn't have words. So that depends. That those conscious states that change depend on other things. But whether the right hemisphere is conscious, I'm arguing is it's independent of what else is going on. Does that answer?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. And then I am willing to say in the case of a split brain patient or a hemispherectomy patient that each hemisphere, unless it's severely degraded, which is often the case when they decide to give someone a hemispherectomy. Um, but I'm willing to say that at least the hemispheres could count as people. But that raises like so many other issues. Like, how are we gonna, what's the concept of a person? Like, what do we mean by person? We have all these different intuitions and ideas, and so there's a kind of semantic swamp I don't want to get bogged down into. Um, uh, but I do think there's something it's like to be a right hemisphere, and there's something it's like to be a left hemisphere, especially in the cases of split brain patients where where the difference becomes obvious. Yasmin, go ahead.
Okay, so you just gave the example of the right hemisphere, and so the left hemisphere no longer being activated, and so the right hemisphere doesn't have the words. Does the right hemisphere, if there's a, there's a hemispherectomy, is
Mhm.
done from the left, so if there's no longer the left is no longer active, does the right hemisphere have a memory of
Yeah.
it does have a memory, right? It's
Is better in some cases. I mean,
oh, in some cases. Okay.
sometimes there's damage, and I mean it kind of depends. But in the cases where they're able to give reports, and the
Uh,
right hemisphere often can't, it usually doesn't produce any
the
language,
language.
but it can demonstrate knowledge and memories of the past, recognizing family members and so on.
So is it anything? So I could be nothing like this. I was thinking about how people who have had a limb removed, right? And they
Oh
still
yeah.
feel like the limb is still there and they go to want to move something or they
Yeah.
feel like a scratch or an itch or something. I just wondered if it was, I guess it's not really like that, but
So you're referring to phantom limb phenomenon, or
yeah, like
phantom limb pain. Yeah. It
one hemisphere knows the other hemisphere is kind of still in there, but not active or something. I don't know.
I I think only like analogously, or metaphorically, that's the case. But the first students, if you don't know what phantom limb pain is, or the phantom limb phenomenon, if you have a limb severed, it's not unusual. So you have an amputation. It's not unusual to feel as if you still have the entire limb. And you might even feel it in a certain position, right? And so I know of one patient who felt his fingernails digging into his palm constantly, right? And this can be alleviated with electrical stimulation, but also with what they call mirror therapy, where you put a mirror in between so you use a mirror so that the other limb, which has not been amputated, makes it look like the amputated limb still has the full limb, right? And by doing this mirror therapy, the details I don't recall easily, that can alleviate the pain or the achiness, etc. Anyways, so yeah, I wouldn't, Yasmin, I wouldn't say um, that that it's like that. I just what the assumption I'm making is that consciousness is intrinsic to whatever has it. So if material, if you know, gray matter in the brain, if that's conscious, it's
Mhm.
intrinsically so.
Okay,
Yeah,
I see.
yeah,
Thank you.
sure. Uh, Alejandro writes, I'm thinking of the neuron that are nested in our stomach. We have neurons, yes, and digestive tract also host bacteria and other functioning mechanisms which influence our state of consciousness for how our minds might sink into a regular one. Um, I think okay, I mean, we do have like neural clusters in the stomach and elsewhere, raising the question of whether they have any consciousness. Uh, Zaw says, could consciousness also be in our hearts? There's also some neurons in the heart, according to research. Yes, there's um, yeah, I see that the heart's little brain. I think I might have seen this actual article. But there are people who do think that, for example, if you have a heart transplant, that might even transfer uh, certain dispositions. So I don't know if the research on this is very strong, and I think gets a lot of pushback in neuroscience. But there was this anecdote of someone waking up from a heart transplant, and they suddenly had a craving for something like Cheetos, and they never liked Cheetos. And according to the anecdote, the donor loved Cheetos. It's hard to know if this was concocted, fabricated. Um, But if we do have, get more evidence of that, the best explanation would be that neurons in the heart were altered enough to play a role in your preference for Cheetos. Yeah. Okay. So instead of going to the objections now, as I said in the video, we're gonna hear from uh, Richard Swinburne. So one moment while I set that up. Okay, and I'd like you to tell me if it's choppy. So first I'm sharing computer sound, optimize for video sharing. Hopefully it's not choppy. So after whatever, a few seconds, if it's not choppy, give me green checks. And I only need a few. I really only need one, I think. Okay, so this is Richard Swinburne, and he's being interviewed by Robert Lawrence Kuhn, uh, who is worked in neuroscience.
Richard is an old brain scientist. The question of whether we need a non-physical component to make consciousness out of brain has been something that's obsessed me my whole life. As the decades have gone on, more and more neuroscientists, even some theologians, are saying we do not need such non-physical component. What is your view?
I certainly think we do. If you're to describe the whole history of the world, you must describe not merely what happens to the bits of this body, but what me am aware of.
Thanks, people. I'm going to clear the feedback.
It's one truth that that certain things are happening to neurons in my brain, but it's another truth that I am aware of certain things, and these are connected with each other. But let's give you. There are different empirical arguments that can be given for this, but here's one. The brain consists of two hemispheres: left hemisphere, right hemisphere, joined by a main tract, the corpus callosum. There have been patients in which the corpus callosum has been severed. Those patients behave in most ways completely normally, but
the body scanner reveals the brutal truth about your body that your regular scale will never tell you. For weeks, my scale...
But in a certain way, they don't behave completely normally. Suppose you fixate them, that's to say you make them stare straight ahead and put a screen such that each eye is can look either side of the screen. And then you flash some signal from the right-hand side to them so that it lands on the right side of each eye. This signal is then transmitted to the left side of the brain. And what you find is that if you ask the patient what this signal was, it might say you might show them something. You might show them a key, and you ask them, well, what did you see? They can only give you the answer by means of the limbs or of the mouth under the control of this hemisphere, so that, and that means the things on the right side of the body. So if you show them a key on this side, you say, what do you see? They can write key with their right hand. But if you ask them to tell you with their left hand what they could see, they can't tell you, and conversely for signals from the other side. Now, that's suggested to people, well, what's going on? And one explanation of what's going on is that by severing the corpus callosum, you've created two centers of consciousness. There's, say, two people who are aware of, one person's aware of the signals from this side, the other person's aware of the signal from that side. And of course, when you don't fixate them, when you remove the screen, they get the signals from both sides, and so they don't show any difference of behavior. Well, that's one explanation, but there are other explanations of what's happening. One explanation might be that one of these hemispheres is simply unconscious and is giving.
Okay, so just pausing for a moment. He's giving two explanations, and the first is you have two spheres of consciousness. Can someone tell us who expressed that view that we've seen so far? the two spheres of consciousness idea. So the answer is V.S. Ramachandran. And I put that in the chat. He's the one who's speaking about the patient, and he's asking the patient, are you in California? Are you on the moon? Are you a woman? Do you believe in God? And the hemispheres are giving sometimes give different answers, but sometimes they don't. That's V.S. Ramachandran. And now Swinburne is saying, or you could say that the consciousness is just in one hemisphere. Can someone tell me who thought that? So I don't know if you're just not remembering the names, or if you're confused about what these different people think. The answer to that, the one who thought back in the 80s at least that consciousness resided only in the left hemisphere is Michael Gazzaniga. Okay, and we saw him getting interviewed by Alan Alda, and we saw the patient Joe. We don't know his last name, right? There were two videos featuring Michael Gazzaniga. One of them had, and both had Gazzaniga and Joe, and one of them had Alan Alda interviewing them. Okay.
Giving its answers on automatic pilot, but is not aware of anything. And clearly we operate quite a lot of the time on automatic pilot. I might drive along a road talking about philosophy and simply respond automatically to the signals. And so the left brain might respond automatically to the key ring by writing key. So it may be that only one of these hemispheres is conscious, and it might be this one, it might be that one. Another explanation is that there might still be only one person in control of the two hemispheres, but the effect of what you've done means that that person can only express certain bits of knowledge in a certain way. They can only express what comes in this way through the right hand and what comes in this way through the left hand. So there's a number of hypotheses equally compatible with the data. And these hypotheses are hypotheses about how many people there are. So the mere fact that you have an organized brain doesn't tell you anything about how many people there are in control of this brain. This is a further thing. And
ditch your old gross shower head. Shower with Jolie instead. This isn't just any shower head. It is specifically
clearly it's a
Again, sorry about that. The ads are new. Perhaps because I keep sending 40 plus students to watch this video every semester. Anyways, I try to keep the ads out.
Thing about whether there is a person or not. And this is, since it can't be a thing solely about the physical, because we know everything about the physical, it must be something about something non-physical. And therefore, the only possible explanation of why we are ignorant, it's our ignorance about how many people there are, and the fact that it clearly is a fact about how many people there are, since it isn't a fact about the physical, it must be a fact about the non-physical, suggests that what's happening is my soul is separate from the brain with which it's to contact. When the corpus callosum is severed, we don't know what happens to my soul, but of course we don't know what happened to immaterial things, so that's not a problem. And it may be that separating the corpus callosum does indeed create two souls, or perhaps it leaves only one in control. We can explain our ignorance because it's an ignorance about the non-physical, but if all of the truths were about the physical, we would know the answer, and that suggests that we must explain the human condition in terms of two parts.
I think that's a fascinating argument. However, from just looking at it physically, if we have the different experience from different parts of the brain when the corpus callosum is cut,
Okay. So before we hear more from Robert Lawrence Kuhn, are there questions about his argument? I put this in the chat. He's saying, look, there's a question. How many people do we have when we do a split brain operation? Do we have one, two, more, zero? What is it? That's a fact, right? And whatever the answer is, even if we don't know. And in fact, he says we don't know, but we know everything that we need to know about. He says we know everything about the physical. He doesn't mean that neuroscience is finished. I noticed that in the comments for this YouTube video, at least one person thought that that's what he was saying. That's absolutely not what he's saying. He's just saying we know that there are two hemispheres that were connected and no longer are connected. We know they're both active. We know how they perform under experiments, etc. Right? But none of that, he thinks, none of that settles our ignorance and tells us how many people there are. But there's got to be a number of people, whether it's one, two, or something else. There's just got to be some number to that. And so since it isn't settled by the physical, it must be settled by the non-physical, or he says by the material, so it must be settled by the immaterial. And we might remain confused about that, but then no surprise, because if there's an immaterial world of souls and so on, we haven't learned much about it. We're not doing science on it, right? So it's not if there's an immaterial reality that explains what's going on, it's no surprise that we can't answer the question of how many people there are. Alejandro writes, is it fair to say he's notifying about our recognition for operating states of consciousness? I don't understand. Sorry. Notifying about our recognition. So you can rewrite if you'd like. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, so Swinburne whoever iPhone is, go ahead.
Hey, it's Jerome. I'm sorry, I need to
Jerome.
rename my phone, but
That's okay.
I think it's not really a question. It's just kind of like an observation or a thought I had about it. To me, this kind of, at least what I'm gathering from it, it kind of leads credence to the idea that we do kind of have a soul or some kind of immaterial self that is in there. Maybe that's just because I've already believed that. I just kind of want to justify that belief. But if you're saying that if we get rid of the left side of our brain, then the right side of our brain is suddenly exhibiting habits that we thought were exclusive to the left side of the brain. At least in some cases, I know you said in some cases.
Yeah.
Once you get rid of if they perform that, I don't remember the name of the procedure, but if they get rid of one of the side of the brain, then they're no longer able to speak anymore. But in certain cases, they are. And
Yeah.
And so I don't know, but I think it was also interesting how he said that that they may still be able to they may be experiencing those type of things, but they're just not able to express it. Is that part of what he said in his argument? Was I repeating that right?
Yeah.
He was saying that
Yeah.
they may still be receiving things that are part of their life that we think are, I don't know, we still may be able to think certain things that we may think they forgot, but they're not able to express it the same. I'm not sure if I was understanding that the same way, but
Yes. So, for example, the right hemisphere, we have pretty good reason to think that it does have conscious experience, but it doesn't in most patients. Most people have language on the left or language production on the left. So the right is experiencing things. We have very good reason to think it's having conscious experience, but it's not able to express it like the left hemisphere can. But it can under controlled conditions. It can point to things. It can point to words, etc. And there are patients. There are people who, because of severe uh, uh, epilepsy, etc., have lost their language producing hemisphere, and I don't think there's really anyone who thinks today who thinks that they're not conscious, just acting as if they're conscious. I mean, everyone will agree that they're cognitively impaired in important ways. But I don't know of anyone who just says they're just not conscious at all. Like like your fingernail is not conscious, right? And I think you said, Jerome, that you were partial to the idea of souls, and that's what I was about to bring up when I noticed your hand was up. Uh, uh, I think you said you were before this, and so maybe that's why you prefer this explanation. But I think this is a totally so I don't think it's unscientific to say this is a totally coherent hypothesis that I'm going to address in the slides. But a lot of people in science think it shouldn't be taken seriously. But to the extent that it's testable, and I think in some cases it is, I think it should be taken seriously. If I had to, well, I'll address it in the slides. I'll say more about it when we get there. Yasmin says, to add to Jerome's point, at least Dr. Swinburne is not ruling out the idea of a soul. He's not ruling it out, and he thinks it's the best explanation, as we will see. And he has come the closest to addressing hemispherectomy. So he has an old book. It might be in Is There a God? Or it might be in something like Do We Have Souls? I don't remember. It's pretty old. And he seems to be unaware of the fact that the hemispherectomy is a reality. And so he just thinks of it as a thought experiment. This was back in like the 70s or the 80s that he wrote this. And so he just wasn't informed of this, and that's okay because a lot of people weren't. I've met people in neuroscience that are totally unaware of this, of hemispherectomies. So so he does a similar thought experiment to argue that we must have souls. Okay, let's go back to the video.
One might think, that if there is some non-physical component, it wouldn't be limited of which side of the brain it was associated with, and that soul should know both sides of the brain.
Oh, well, why one should think that at all. Of course, it will know both sides of the brain if the corpus callosum is operative, because signals that arrive here will be transmitted to there. But if the brain is cut, then it may be it's simply associated with one or simply associated with the other.
So this non-physical element, this soul, sort of has a one-to-one correspondence?
Well, it's got to operate somewhere. I mean, it doesn't operate over the whole body. It operates over certain parts of the brain, and there are different theories about which part, in the normal person, about which part of the brain, as it were, is conscious, is the locus of consciousness. And one theory is that it's just the cortex that is conscious. Another theory is that it's the brainstem that's conscious. So, any rate, without all these phenomena, you have to say that certain parts of the brain are responsible for consciousness. And therefore, it's not going to be an extraordinary theory if you say, well, it's the cortex, but it's only this part of the cortex. That would be within the normal sort of operative operations of neurophysiology. But when you
This is my favorite dentist hack to clean my retainer. If you wear a retainer every night like I do, you know how hard it is to keep.
My point is that we don't know which part of the brain is the conscious part when we go through this operation of severing the corpus callosum. And that, since we don't know where consciousness operates, but there is a truth about how many people there are, that truth must be something about something else.
What about other evidence in terms of the existence of a soul? There is evidence from so-called parapsychological, paranormal, occultic, ESP type.
I have no views on that. Such evidence as I've seen is pretty weak, I think.
There's evidence from religious experience in terms of suggesting some non-physical relation. The evidence you've presented for the existence of a soul or a non-physical component is very much an analysis of the physiology and the expression of physiology.
That's right. I think you don't need to bring God into this at all. This is simply to give a full description of the data, because the data are that people have thoughts, that people have feelings, that people have the desires. And because any knowledge of the brain won't tell you how many people have feelings, desires, and so on, or which people have feelings, desires, and so on, this must be a further fact. And since it's not a fact about the brain, it must be a fact about something else. Don't need to bring religion into this at all. So, in summary, my claim is that however much you know about the physical world, you won't know how many people there are. And therefore, being a person isn't a truth about the physical world. It's a truth about something immaterial in causal connection with the physical world, which in odd circumstances, we won't know how many of these there are.
Richard?
Okay. Go ahead, Yasmin.
Sorry, I have a question about something he just said, and you would have to actually go back. It was something to the effect of how would we know if we're part of the physical world or something? Like I just was like, what?
I don't think he says how would we know if we are part of the physical world, but he does say how would we know where the immaterial conscious entity, the soul, interacts with the brain, like which hemisphere, etc. How would we know that? And then later he also says that being a person is, and I'm happy to go back if you can estimate where it is, but he says
Yeah,
something like, well, let's at least try going back to where he.
it was pretty close to the end, but
Let's try here.
okay.
You say, well, it's the cortex, but it's only this part of the cortex.
I think it was just before that.
The normal.
Just a little bit before that. Sorry.
That's all right. It's all right.
Well, it's got to operate somewhere. I mean, it doesn't operate over the whole body. It operates over certain parts of the brain, and there are different theories about which part, in the normal person, about which part of the brain, as it were, is.
So, is this in the vicinity?
Yeah, I think that was. It might be
Okay.
a little further toward. Anyway, that's fine. I
Further
think I'll go
back?
back after class and look at it because I was like,
Okay,
wait, what
okay.
did he just?
Well, what he's saying right now is relevant to something coming up in the slides. He's talking about the soul as if it's in causal interaction with the brain. And he's also saying, like, it's not in causal interaction with the whole body. It's somewhere in the brain. Remember, I say remember. Long ago, we talked about dualism and interactionism. There are different types of dualism. One is interactionism. He's a dualist interactionist. So he believes that the soul is like it transmits signals to the brain. It controls the brain. And then the brain controls the soul. And to the extent that things that the brain senses, sensory information, is somehow relayed to the soul so that you can have a conscious experience, right? That's his view. And I will be arguing that that is a testable view. And so, yeah, you can go back and find what you're looking for, and we can address it. Any other before we move on? And we're not moving on. We're just away. We're not moving away from this issue, but we're moving forward. Any other questions or points? Okay. Let's look at the objections. Oh, I got something in the chat. That is sort of what I aim to say. He attempted to show how there is possible level of our consciousness. He's trying to so the basic argument is there's a certain number of people in that split brain patient. 1, 2, we don't know. But the fact that we don't know shows that the answer doesn't lie in the material world. Because we can look at the material, we can say, well, there's 2 hemispheres and there's one brain that's now been split and there's one midbrain and they're both active in this case. And under the experiments, the patient does this, and that. We know all that, but none of those facts explain or answer the question of how many people there are. But he thinks there is an answer to that question. Therefore, the answer lies in the immaterial. Okay. Okay, so here are the three objections that I come across most often. The first one is that the surviving mind, in the case of whether it's just surviving in the moment because of a WADA test or a hemispherectomy, is an immaterial entity. That's the account that we just saw given by Richard Swinburne. It's something immaterial, which once interacted, so interactionism, with the whole brain, but now interacts with a hemisphere. That's one. And I'll get to the chat in a moment. The second one is that the surviving mind is associated not with the hemisphere, but with some region, such as the midbrain, that remains conscious throughout. So maybe it's like the thalamus or something that's under the cortex, and that thing is always that thing's never anesthetized or removed, right? So maybe that's what's conscious, not the hemispheres. And then finally, this is the one that I used to believe. The surviving mind somehow contracts, right? It was once associated with the whole brain, like it's some pattern of energy. And when one hemisphere goes to sleep, it kind of contracts over to the right. And then when the left wakes up, it kind of pops back over. And then the right goes to sleep and it goes like that. And does this little two-step, like that. And that's what I used to think. And I just thought, okay, that's weird, but I guess that's how it works. We'll get to those. Layla writes, so when he says we don't know how many people there are, he is referring to consciousness. He's referring to conscious entities. Yeah, he's saying we don't know how many things there are that are having experiences and memories and willing actions, deciding to do things, etc. So let's get to the objections. Let's look at the first objection, which I think not only should we take it seriously, I think it's a scientific hypothesis. And most people do not recognize this, even in philosophy. And I'll say why. And I think I have as strong an argument as one can have for this. So in reply to the objection that, okay, here's the real conscious you is an immaterial entity, a soul or something like it. The reply is, and so when a hemisphere goes down, the soul is no longer in causal contact with it. And so, maybe the soul wants to produce words, but it needs causal connection with a working left hemisphere to do that. And it doesn't have that. Okay. So as I say, this is a coherent analysis of what happens when an experiencing entity survives a hemispherectomy. The immaterial mind loses contact with much of its material complement. And did we do this? I think we did. Did we talk about the drone? Okay, good. I wasn't sure because I reorganized things. So in the remote control drone analogy, the this is not Wall-E, the character, the robot who's independently moving around. This is a toy that you control. And in fact, we can use a real drone to make the point more clear, because this is one of the drones on Mars. Mars is now crawling with a few different drones, and they're being controlled by NASA. And I think China has at least one also. So there's a few, and they're being controlled. Some are being controlled by NASA, and there's a lag, right? But they transmit signals to it to get it to do things. They remotely control it, and then it transmits signals back to NASA so they can see what it sees and measure what it measures and so on, right? Now imagine that there are Martians and they see these things and they think of them as independently operating things, and maybe they capture one and it moves and it's intelligent, it acts intelligent, right? But they capture one and they start taking it apart and they can figure out how it works. But at some point they'll get to that receiver transmitter, that antenna thing, right? And if they can do enough science, they will have good reason to believe that that thing is in causal interaction with something else they know not what. It's in causal interaction with something else that's not around. It's not material. There's nothing, pushing it, bumping into it. They don't see anything, but they'd have good reason to think it's in causal interaction with something that they might call immaterial, because it's not bumping into it, it's not taking up space. It's the electromagnetic field, or signals being sent through the electromagnetic field, right? So they'd have every reason to formulate that hypothesis, and that's a testable hypothesis. And in fact, it's true, right? Now, some people might quibble and they'll say, yeah, but the electromagnetic field is in a sense still part of the material world. I think that's just semantics, right? What we originally meant by material was things that bump into each other and take up space, right? And in an exclusive way. And the electromagnetic field doesn't work that way. And so that's just to show that there's a totally analogous kind of reasoning that's testable and that is in fact correct. Now, by analogy, someone like Swinburne could say that's how the brain works. The brain is in causal contact, not with signals sent by NASA through the electromagnetic field, but with an immaterial soul. And how could we test that? Well, we could look at brains, and if we ever discover that brains make state changes that can't be explained locally by material events, but they're intelligent, we'd have excellent reason to believe in souls. And it would be scientifically irresponsible to just ignore that evidence. Okay. Is this metaphor? What is this transmitter between our brain and our soul? Well, I'm not saying what is the transmitter between. I'm just imagining that, as Swinburne believes, that there's an immaterial soul that's interacting causally with the brain. And then you can ask, like, where in the brain does that interaction occur? Rene Descartes, long ago, back in the 1600s, thought it occurred in the pineal gland. We know a lot more than he knows now, but if there's some kind of interaction, then the next question is how does that work, and where is the interaction? Now, having said all that, I do think we should take it seriously. I don't think we have any good evidence right now for this. No one is saying that the brain. Well, let me retract that. Few people are saying that the brain is changing states in ways that seem to depend on interaction with some external other thing, right? The closest I know of someone scientifically informed making this claim is probably Roger Penrose, who's an astrophysicist, and he thinks that the brain states are determined by quantum events, and I think he might be sympathetic with the idea. I don't know. Okay. So it's a testable hypothesis, and I know exactly what a good test would be, but we haven't found the brain behaving as if it is a transceiver or as if it has a transceiver. Okay. So that's my response to the first objection. I'll pause for just a moment. And I did plan to have you do a writing discussion, but I think I'll have you do that after class. And I think iPhone 3 is still Jerome. Unless there's someone else with an iPhone. Okay, the second objection is that there's some other region of the brain that stays conscious all throughout. So whether it's a hemispherectomy or a WADA test, it's not the hemispheres that are, being conscious of anything. It's the midbrain structure, like maybe the thalamus. Remember, they talked about the brainstem, right, which includes the thalamus. So first, I wrote back long ago in like 2016, I think it was, this is a radical departure from our current understanding of the brain, that the cortex is not conscious. That there are more people today that are sympathetic with this idea. So it's maybe no longer a radical departure from our current understanding. There are plenty of people who would consider it to be that. Plenty of people who think, no, it's the cortex is conscious. And notice this is not saying that the midbrain structure is required for consciousness. That's a pretty standard view. You need a thalamus. And if you destroy the midbrain, it's not clear that the patient has any remaining consciousness. But that's different than saying it's the thalamus and only or the midbrain structure and only the midbrain structure that is conscious. And the cortex is not conscious at all, right? And so maybe it's true. I don't claim to have a knockdown argument at this point. Maybe that's the case. Maybe the cortex is just like a processing region, and the conscious experience gets kind of uploaded to it and processed, and then it returns to the conscious midbrain. And this means that a patient that has no cortex might still be conscious, even though they'd be unable to do a lot of cognitive processing. Reply two, even if a subcortical structure, midbrain, brainstem, is the true base of the surviving mind, the possibility remains that that very thing can be divided in uncounted ways. And the main conclusion still holds, right? So the first point is just to say that most people don't believe this in neuroscience. And so it seems like the burden would be on people who are making this case. But I grant that it might be true. And then in the second case, I'm just going to point out that whatever it is that's conscious, the same argument holds of it, even if in reality we haven't done the equivalent of split brain, operations and so on these subcortical regions. So this is the thalamus, a drawing of the thalamus, and some people say that it's required for consciousness, and that might be the case. But it's like the cortex; it has two halves, and the same argument could be applied. And there are in fact people. So sometimes when just a little bit of damage to the thalamus seems to just result in unconsciousness. But in other cases, you have people with severely degraded thalamuses, and they're still, by any measure, conscious. And so I don't think this objection escapes or completely, succeeds against the thesis. And then finally, we get this. What time is it? Okay. The view I used to hold, the mind somehow contracts, and so the right hemisphere goes to sleep during a WADA test, and so it's one mind, and it kind of goes like this. And now it's just hanging out in the left hemisphere, thinking things like, I don't get the joke, and I can't follow the metaphor, and and then the whole mind comes back, and the single mind that is now being realized somehow by two hemispheres, even though just a while ago it was being realized only by one. Now it's thinking, well, that was weird, and I wonder what's going to happen next. And then, oh, I have no words, right? And then back. And this, I think, is very intuitive. So there's just one mind associated with the whole brain. Then after the procedure, this mind becomes associated with the surviving hemisphere in the case of a hemispherectomy, or the surviving hemispheres as you go through the WADA test. And this also avoids the conclusion that there's, in addition to the whole mind, there's a conscious left hemisphere and a conscious right hemisphere, and perhaps even other regions. So that's the view I held for years after learning about hemispherectomies. And it's also the view that Peter Godfrey Smith defends. So he never told me, not that we knew each other, but he references my argument in his book. It's called Metazoa. It's a wonderful book. And one of my students just was reading it one day and saw my name and my argument in there about a year or two after he published. So this is a book so he's also a scuba diver. And so he kind of goes back and forth between his experiences scuba diving, and his philosophical views on consciousness and how it evolved, and consciousness in non-human animals. So he has like a chapter on the octopus, and it's wonderful. And so he defends this view. He says during the water test, the left side loses connection to the functioning right side, and the physical basis for mind contracts as a result. Now, the physical basis for mind contracts. He puts that in scare quotes. And of course, he's not saying that the brain contracts, but physically the brain doesn't shrink or anything. So what does he mean? He's trying to describe this idea that the thing that I would say that realized consciousness is now just the left hemisphere. And then he says, but this is in a philosophy seminar or in a conference, if you were saying that, many people in the audience, many philosophers would say, that's kind of hand waving. You need to spell it out, what exactly you mean. A pattern of activity formerly extended across the whole brain is now confined to one half. That half is now conscious, but it was not a conscious system in itself beforehand. Okay, now here we have to get more careful. And this is what I used to think, but this is why I no longer think it. We have to ask, I'm going to check the time again. Okay, we won't be able to go through all this, but I'll at least set it up. Does this surviving hemisphere have entirely false memories of having once been conscious of life before the procedure? So bear with me. So let's say the left hemisphere gets anesthetized, and Peter Godfrey Smith thinks that means that there's one mind, a pattern of activity, that has a physical basis that contracts, whatever that means. That thing now resides over here somehow. Okay. And what's it thinking? It's thinking, this is amazing. I have no words. Which sounds to me like it's thinking to itself, I used to have words. I used to be conscious of my ability to use words. But if Peter Godfrey Smith is right, then it's wrong about that. It didn't used to be the right hemisphere. It used to be the whole, occupy both regions. So I don't know what he has in mind. On his view, the right hemisphere thinks it used to be conscious of having words, and it's wrong. Okay. So that's my response. One response. It seems like it requires some kind of false memory. Does anyone happen to know what this comes from? Little cultural reference test. Okay, so in the original, well, you're right that origami comes from Japan, but I'm asking this is from a movie, and it represents something. So in the original 1980 something movie Blade Runner, Harrison Ford and Rutger Hauer and others, in that movie, some of the characters have implanted memories. They have fake memories. And this origami unicorn represents that in the movie. And so there's also in philosophy, Bertrand Russell's 5-minute hypothesis. And he says it's logically possible that the universe sprang into existence 5 minutes ago with all this apparent record of having existed prior, so like rusty metal and a dead animal on the road or something. All these signs, light coming to us from the stars, as if it's been crossing the galaxy all this time. But no, everything started 5 minutes ago, and your brain is in a state that includes all these false memories of having been a child and so on. And he just makes that point that it's logically possible. He doesn't think we should believe it. But it sounds like what Peter Godfrey Smith is saying is that the right hemisphere, when it's thinking, I have no words, it's falsely believing that it used to have words and have conscious experience of it. And that's the part that I don't think we can accept. Zaw says about consciousness, I also think people with schizophrenia can sometimes hear voices in their heads or talk to people who aren't really there, but they can still interact pretty normally in their surroundings. It's like their sense of consciousness is something their minds have created on their own, I guess. Well, there is a theory I don't know much about that thinks that it has to do with timing, and so if you're not schizophrenic, your thoughts impress you as your own. They're your own thoughts. But if they arrive a little bit later and get processed a little bit later, you might think of them as external, like they're intrusive thoughts or even voices. So there is that theory that, again, I don't know much about it, but an attempt to explain schizophrenia. Okay, and the next objection is this one, that it's subject to problems reminiscent of classical fission problems. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. We'll get to it next time. Fission problems involve, maybe two people splitting and, becoming two in some ways. So we'll get to that next time. That's all for today. Thanks, everyone. Ending the recording.